All right, Maddie.
All right, take it away.
Yep.
All right. So thanks everyone for having me. My name is Maddie Magnuson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And I am a prevention coordinator with Maine Family Planning. So basically, we work with Jean at the DOE to write curriculum for the state of Maine. So we're right now updating practices and STI and pregnancy prevention for high school.
Susan, it still says paused, the recording. Sorry, Maddie, I didn't mean to.
Oh, you're all right. And we also support educators. So we support educators in their health curriculum, sexual health specifically is what we do. But today we're talking about inclusivity for LGBTQ students in health and PE. So I hope that's why everyone's here. And I have a PowerPoint to share. So I thought we'd start with that just to kind of have a foundation so we have some common knowledge and some common understanding upon which to have a conversation. And then I have about 5 scenarios that I've come up with for us to discuss as a group of, how can we create more inclusive schools as well as classes for LGBTQ students. Does anyone have any questions or comments off the bat before we get started? And you can use the chat or you can just speak up, either way. All right. Well, feel free to type stuff into the chat if things do come up. I'll start by sharing the PowerPoint. Jean or Susan, can you allow me to have permissions to share screen?
You got it.
Thank you. All right. Let's see here.
Okay.
Okay. So, like I said, this is inclusivity for health education and physical education. So what we have going on for an agenda is I'm going to talk a little bit about LGBTQ health disparities. We're going to touch upon the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey data. They do have LGBT fact sheets, like an LGBT one and then a trans youth one. For 2017, I haven't seen the fact sheets for the 2019 data yet, but it's possible that it'll be coming out at some point. But it's very helpful, and so we'll take a look at that. We're going to go over some basic concepts like the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation and things like that, and some of those definitions. And then we're going to talk about some basic strategies for supporting LGBTQ youth. And then we're going to talk about resources and then, like I said, scenarios for us to kind of brainstorm and discuss together, so I'm not just talking at you for the whole hour. Great, so we'll jump in. Let's see here. So first, I just want to recognize that LGBTQ youth are at higher risk for things like substance use, STDs or STIs, bullying, isolation, anxiety, depression, and suicide than their heterosexual peers. So this comment is with data from the CDC, but again, we also see that within Maine specific data. So when we're thinking about our health classes or our physical education, I often think in our culture we talk about health as really based upon individual choices. We think someone who's healthy has made positive choices that make them a healthy person, and someone who has less, healthy outcomes has made choices that weren't good for their health, right? When in reality, we know that there are bigger structural factors at play. And so when we want to support the health of all our students, not only should we be talking about what they can do individually, but what can we do as a community, as a school, to support everyone's health. So the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey, this is from 2017. And they found that about 3% of Maine high school students, and this is for high school, identified as either transgender or unsure. And about 15% of Maine high school students identified as either gay, lesbian, bisexual, or unsure. And as we can see, LGBT students were significantly more likely, looks like by about 17% to be bullied at school. And in that bullying, about a third of LGBT students reported that it was offensive comments or attacks at school based on their perceived sexual orientation. And about a fifth, so about 22%, said that they had received offensive comments or attacks based upon their gender presentation. So maybe being seen as too masculine or too feminine. And so we see that LGBT students are more than twice as likely to feel unsafe at school. So we see that there's incidences of violence and bullying at school towards LGBT students, and that is affecting LGBT students' health. So for example, they're more than twice as likely to report smoking cigarettes in the last 30 days. They're significantly more likely to report having used alcohol in the last 30 days. Twice as likely to have ever used heroin, twice as likely to have ever used cocaine, and twice as likely to have ever used inhalants. And suicide risk, again, is significantly higher than their heterosexual peers. It's hard to look at this data, but the good news is there are things that educators and staff and students can do to increase the health outcomes for LGBT students and decrease violence. So this is a diagram representing the minority stress model. So this is a theory basically that helps explain why minority groups like LGBT people have more health disparities. So you can see the graph at the top has stigma, right? So we can have stigma and discrimination on a structural level. So that's like the Supreme Court ruling on Monday that you can't fire people because they're gay or transgender, right? So up until that moment in many states in our country, you could fire someone just because they're gay or transgender. So when we have things like policies, cultural norms, and things like that that are discriminatory or stigmatizing, that will then affect interpersonal stigma and discrimination, right? So you see interpersonal next to the structural here. And so that can be things like these incidences of bullying, right? Or incidences of, say, not allowing a trans student to use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, right? So when we have minority groups experiencing stigma and discrimination at the structural level, and the interpersonal level, that can cause interpersonal stigma. And that's something like, maybe I am a freak, maybe I'm a waste of space. Like you start to have a maybe negative self-esteem, you might have increased stress, anxiety, and depression, like we see in this diagram. And that causes health disparities and inequalities, right? You might start using cigarettes as a coping mechanism, right? Or something like that. And so it's not because minority communities are any sicker or different biologically than heterosexual people, right? But it's because of this stigma and discrimination that they face on the structural level, and again, in an interpersonal space as well. So again, that's important to remember, and that's something that can be talked about within health classes, that we want to be promoting individual healthy choices, and we want to be promoting a culture of respect and a culture of care, and how do we create systems that support everybody. Okay. So now we're going to jump into just some basic concepts. So when we're talking about LGBT people, we can have a common understanding of what do we mean, right? So this is a picture of a unicorn. You might have seen a similar picture called the genderbread person. It's the same kind of thing. It's helping us explain what are these different concepts. So you'll see pointing to the unicorn's head is a little rainbow, and that is representing gender identity. So we all have a gender identity, right? And I'll get to more of that. And then you'll see down here with the like double helix between the unicorn's legs, right? So that's maybe representing chromosomes or representing genitalia or reproductive organs, things like that. That's sex assigned at birth. So in our culture, people are assigned either male or female, usually based upon external genitals. So is there a penis or is there not a penis? Now we recognize that biological sex characteristics are much more wide than just our external genitals, right? We have our internal reproductive organs. We have our hormones, and the big one is our secondary sex characteristics. This is really how we did, assume someone's gender, right? So we'll say, okay, this person has a deep voice, so I'm going to assume this person identifies as a man. Or I see this person has a beard or no beard, and then you assume gender based upon those secondary sex characteristics. So let's say this unicorn was assigned female at birth. For growing up, the unicorn is like, I'm a boy. I identify as a boy. I want to do boy things. So then we would maybe consider this unicorn to be a trans boy, right? Assigned female at birth but identifies as a boy. That being said, maybe the unicorn was assigned female at birth and identifies as a girl, right? Still has a gender identity, right? It just matches the sex she was assigned at birth, right? So everyone has a gender identity. Does that make sense? Nod if it's yes. If you're confused, let me know and feel free to put in the chat. So we all have a gender identity and we have a sex assigned at birth. You'll also notice in this that has intersex, right? So about around 2% of the population, so about as many people that have red hair are intersex, and that can represent a variety of medical conditions. But basically it means someone's sex characteristics don't fit neatly within that female or male box. Maybe they have an ovary and a testy or something to that effect. And again, biological variation is normal. Now we have to recognize on the structural level, we have performed surgeries upon intersex infants so that they fit more neatly within those two boxes. And those aren't often medically necessary, but do cause, again, a lot of stigma and shame to the people who are put through them. So that's an example of some structural stigma and discrimination. So we've talked about the sex assigned at birth, gender identity. The green dots around the unicorn is to represent gender expression. So gender expression is things like the way we cut our hair, what clothes we use or wear, could be like how I talk with my hands or how I walk down the street, do I paint my nails, things like that. Our gender expression can be an intentional signifier to the outside world of this is how I identify. Or for some people, they don't really think a lot about their gender expression. They're just like, I wear this because this is what's comfortable to me, right? So just because, I'm gonna use you as an example, Jean, just because Jean might have short hair and maybe wears pants a lot, doesn't mean that Jean's trying to signify I'm a man, right? It's just, that's comfortable, right? So for some people, they might wear things or have gender expression that's trying to be a communication of their gender to the world. And for other people, not so much, right? So basically, we don't want to assume someone's gender identity just based on their gender expression. The only way we know someone's gender is if they tell us, right? And then we have these two hearts here representing who we're physically or emotionally attracted to. And the reason that that's separated out is that some people identify as asexual, meaning that they don't feel sexual attraction necessarily, but they still might want to have romantic relationships and close bonds with people. They might just not be sexually motivated. So we're going to separate those out. All right. So those are some concepts. And again, so gender identity is different from sexual orientation, but we often lump minority communities all together, right? We have LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, some of those words are representing sexual orientation, and some of those words are representing gender identity. And it's important to know also that language evolves over time, right? So I identify as queer, but if I say that sometimes in a more rural community, maybe to an older generation, they might cringe at that word because that has historically been used as a slur against LGBT people, right? And so they might say, oh my gosh, why are you using that word to identify yourself? Versus for me, in the culture that I grew up in, it was an empowering word and one that was less specific than, oh, I have to pick, am I bisexual or am I gay or, kind of. And for a lot of people, it's much more complicated than that, especially when you throw in a gender identity that isn't man or woman, right? So, and then we also have identities based on culture. So for example, two-spirit. So there might be students from Native communities in Maine who identify as Two-Spirit, and that's a word specific to their culture to represent, again, potentially gender identities outside of the binary. But it's important to know that those terms are for their culture and not for people outside of their culture. All right, so pronouns. Pronouns have gotten more recognition lately as there's been more awareness towards the trans community in the media and stuff, which is really great. So basically, pronouns are the words we use in the place of someone's name, right? So most women use she, her, hers pronouns. So Lynette, I'm going to use you as an example. If I was talking about Lynette, rather than having to use Lynette's name all the time, I could say, you know, Lynette's my boss and she's really great and I like her hair, right? Everyone has a pronoun. And so there are some people that use less common pronouns. For example, they, them, theirs is being used more often by people who identify as non-binary. And so to use that in a sentence, for example, I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I do identify as non-binary. So people could say, Maddie, they presented on inclusive health education today, and I hope to see them again sometime. So that's an example of using my pronouns in a sentence. I want to recognize that if you have to use a pronoun that you're not used to, it's going to be challenging, right? So down here we also have z, zers, zers, which is less common, but a student might use them. And maybe you want to be really respectful of that student, right? Because you remember the minority stress and the negative health disparities when we discriminate against people, right? And you're like, I don't want to be causing that negative health disparity. So I'm going to do my best to use the student's pronouns, even though I'm very confused by it. So you really just have to practice, right? Just like anything else, like you were learning a new language, I encourage people, if they're confronted with a term or pronoun for someone that they're not familiar with, you really have to put in the time and effort. Otherwise you are going to mess up and you are going to cause harm, even if you're not intentionally trying to harm someone, but you're going to if you don't put in that time. So, you know, when you're driving, if you're driving to the store later today, or you're doing your dishes after lunch, you know, just practice. Maddie, they were my presenter, they have brown hair, and, you know, I hope I get to learn from them again sometime, and maybe I'll email them to ask more about, you know, something. So practice using the student's name in a sentence with their pronouns, again, when you're by yourself, so that you can rewire your brain. It's really important. And then if you notice yourself messing up, which, again, it's common, even people within the community will mess up, right? You can have people who are trans in a trans support group and they might misgender someone else in the support groups. It happens, right? Because we're all baked in this culture that says, you know, man or woman based upon these characteristics or these signifiers, right? So it might take a while for people to rewire. So if you do notice yourself messing up in the moment, just correct yourself. So for example, I'm gonna use you again, Jean. If Jean said, oh, hi everyone, this is Maddie, they are here to talk to us about, you know, this topic. So if you're able to correct yourself in the moment, just correct yourself quickly and move on. The big thing is to not over apologize, because then you're putting the attention on yourself, right? And then if you're like, oh gosh, I'm really sorry, Maddie, like I really didn't mean to, this is really hard for me, then I'm going to be in a position of probably wanting to be like, it's okay. And then I'm in a position to comfort you, which isn't really helpful, especially if you're having that type of interaction all the time. And so it's more important to just kind of either apologize quickly or correct yourself quickly and move on. That's a little bit about pronouns. So other things that we can do to be more inclusive of LGBT students is using inclusive language. So instead of saying, hey, boys and girls, you might say like, hey, class, hey, students, like, hey, folks, things like that. Or maybe the boyfriend, girlfriend one is big. I often tell the story of, you know, it's like every time you have a big family gathering like Thanksgiving and you only see these family members once a year, they're always like, hey, do you have a boyfriend yet? And that can be, it can cause a lot of stress for a young person who might be gay, right? It's like, do I come out to this family member I only see once a year, or, you know, do I come out to my teacher? So you can use inclusive language, and instead of saying, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you could say, do you have a sweetie? Do you have a date to prom, right? Things like that. So when you're asking questions, we don't want to be assuming the student's sexual orientation. And then similar with parents too. And again, oftentimes when we are being inclusive, we're going to be including people we're not even intending to, right? So you might be like, okay, I want to say parents because maybe the student has 2 moms or 2 dads, right? So I don't want to say mother, father. But you're also being inclusive potentially to the student who maybe has a parent who's been incarcerated and maybe they're in the foster system or things like that. So when you're using inclusive language, oftentimes you'll find you're being inclusive of different populations as well, which is really nice. And the other thing is to just notice your assumptions, right? Like notice if you're like assuming people's gender identity or sexual orientation. We all make assumptions. We just want to be aware of them so we're not, again, perpetuating stigma. If that makes sense. Okay, almost through with me talking at you, and then we'll all get to talk together about some scenarios. So some different strategies for being inclusive of LGBT students, and this is a picture on the side from Teaching Tolerance. They have best practices for serving LGBT students, which you can download for free on their website, so you can search for that. I'll also show there's some great resources from GLSEN as well. But one thing to be inclusive is to know what the state protections are in Maine, which we have good state protections. So even if you see federal policies being changed by the administration, we still have state protections, so it doesn't matter. So even if Trump says like medical providers can turn away a patient because they don't want to treat a trans patient, in Maine, you still can't do that because we have the Maine Human Rights Act that doesn't allow discrimination. Right, and that includes for students, right? So the 2014 case involving Nicole Maines from Orono, right? So that was a really great progress for us in Maine in that it helps define what those protections were for trans students. So the court ruled that she should be able to use the bathroom that aligned with her gender identity, right? So she's a girl, she's a trans girl, but she's still a girl. She gets to use the girl's bathroom because they were encouraging her to use like a nurse's bathroom or some other type of restroom. And that's not equal, having it separate, right? So she should be able to use the bathroom that aligns with her gender identity, and similarly other facilities as well. So we know that students in Maine have those rights. They also have a right, again, to not be bullied or harassed and things like that. And so it's important for schools to have policies that reflect those state protections. So anti-bullying policies, do you know what it is? Do you know the protocol if it's happening? So if a student comes to you, you know how to respond. And again, like if you have a student who is trans, are you in alignment with policies and practices? Another tip to be LGBTQ inclusive is to be visibly inclusive. So, right, when minority communities often assume that they're going to face stigma and discrimination, right? So we might not want to go to school because we're afraid we'll be bullied, or we might be afraid to go to the doctor because we don't know if they're going to respect us and our identity, things like that. So it doesn't help for you to know, like, I'm supportive of the LGBT community. You have to be outwardly supportive so that they know too. So that can be, maybe you have a rainbow flag or a safe space sticker. Maybe you put your pronouns in your email signature, or what, you know, something, whatever communications you're putting out to families. You have, again, certain signifiers that they don't know you, right? You have a new class coming in the fall. Make sure that whatever communication you have makes it obvious that you're a safe person for them to go to talk, or again, if they've faced bullying or harassment, that they can go to you as a safe person. I also saw an example online of a teacher who had students fill out a form at the beginning of the year, you know, so that what's the name you like to be called, whether that's a nickname or, you know, something else, what are your pronouns or whatever, just kind of getting to know the students. It had some get to know you questions, but also had that information so that they could make sure their roster matched up with what the students want to be called, right? Because they didn't want to be calling someone by the wrong name. Having regular and ongoing staff and professional development is also really helpful. So again, when we want to combat that interpersonal stigma and discrimination, as well as that structural that we talked about earlier, it's important that everyone's informed, right? Because oftentimes people have good intentions, they're just acting out of ignorance, and that causes harm, right? And then we want to be responding to bias, prejudice, or hate in the moment, and again, leaning on our policies to accomplish that. So an example here from this teaching tolerance toolkit was, you know, if a parent said, you know, I am, or my child is uncomfortable being in the locker room with this transgender student or this gay student, you could respond, well, your child can use an alternative space if they're not comfortable, but we can't force another student to use another space because that's discriminatory, right? So just because someone objects to an LGBT student doesn't mean they get to have the LGBT student conform to what they need to feel safe, right? They can always use an alternative space. And then this last one, responding to gender stereotypes and heteronormativity, which really is a basis, I think, for a lot of homophobia and stuff. So this was an example from an educator in the Lewiston Auburn area, and he was in his PE class and someone said, can I do girl push-ups? And he said, I don't know what girl push-ups are, you can do modified push-ups, right? So it's calling out those instances of sexism or heteronormativity when they come up, because reducing sexism will also reduce homophobia, right? Like we want people to be able to express themselves, like boys should be able to express themselves without being called a sissy or a fag, right? Because that's hurtful and that's harmful. So we want to promote a culture of inclusivity.
And some people will use the term guys. Okay, guys, let's go do this. It's like, that's really sexist.
Yeah, and I do it too, right? So that's actually one of our scenarios. So we'll get to brainstorm.
Oh, good.
What do we do when we have these kinds of ingrained ways of speaking, right? Because again, we're not intentionally trying to harm people. That's just what we've been saying forever. So we have to unlearn it. And these are another couple of resources that you can look up from GLSEN. So one is called Developing LGBTQ Inclusive Classroom Resources. So they have some great tips in that handout, which you can find for free online. And they also have transgender inclusion in high school athletics, which could be helpful for some folks as well. All right, so now we're gonna do scenarios. I'm gonna get out of the PowerPoint so I can see everyone's faces, and I'm gonna just copy and paste the scenarios into the chat and then read them. But when we're thinking about how would we respond to these hypothetical situations, you might think of how you could prevent it from happening, right? So that might be making sure you have ground rules in your classroom, right? And referring to them. How would you respond in the moment? Or how would you follow up after the incident to, again, promote LGBTQ inclusion? So I'm gonna stop share real quick. See if there's any questions in the chat. Looks like no questions so far. Excellent. So the first scenario I have here.
Patty,
Yes, Susan.
I just want to remind people that if somebody wants to unmute, because it's a small group, they can unmute and respectfully interrupt. So
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. So first scenario I have here is you're a staff person, you're in the staff break room, and a colleague of yours says, I feel like students being transgender, it's just a fad or a phase. So how would we respond to this coworker? And I'm going to be quiet to let y'all stew on that for a minute. So everyone's being quiet.
I'll jump in.
Oh, good.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Susan, you have an idea?
well, my thought is most people would not say anything at all.
Yeah, I was going to say people will have a hard time with that, but it's so important for them to say something.
Yeah.
They really have to step out of their comfort. Most people would have to step out of their comfort zone to do that.
Yeah.
So
Do you have strategies for how to respond in that kind of a situation? that you
I've actually heard this before, and I think that, you know, we see young people, especially when they're really discovering who they are and kind of trying things out, and not just their gender identity or, you know, how they dress, but it could be a whole range of things that they're doing because it's developmentally what they're doing at that middle. And to say, well, it could be a fad or it could be a phase. However, this is how they want to be identified right now, and this is what they're using, so we need to honor that. Because we're kind of dismissing them. So it could be just a phase they're going through. It could be something that's very real to them. And either way, they should be respected. So that's one thing I might say.
That's great because you acknowledged what they said, like, oh, it's just a fad. Well, it could be just a fad, but I like what you said, Lynette. That was good.
Absolutely. And I love that suggestion too, because I think we are in a moment of kind of call out culture and cancel culture, right? Which sometimes I think shuts down conversations so that we can't grow and learn. People are afraid to say something because they don't want to be ostracized, right? For not having the right language or whatever it is. So I think just like you said, Lynette, kind of validating, oh yeah, like it could be, you're not being combative, but maybe you're providing also an alternative viewpoint of the importance to validate where a student's at, no matter what, especially when we have those statistics around, you know, mental health and things like that. We want to be sure that we're supporting students in the moment, regardless of whether they evolve or change, because we also recognize most people evolve and change, right? And that's okay. Susan, did you have something?
A starting point for somebody might simply be, I don't agree with you. Not that they have to get into a conversation because they might not be comfortable with that or ready for that, but simply saying, no, I don't agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like first step.
And I think especially if you have other people in the room with you, it's important too, because what we also know is it's not only that there are LGBTQ students, right? There's LGBTQ staff, right? And they might not be out, and they may not be out because there's colleagues saying things like this, right? So we want it to be a safe school, not only for students, but for staff. I have someone here saying, as you said, it could be a phase, but our role is to be respectful and empathetic. Absolutely, I love that. And I think that's you know, one of the things with bystander intervention is like kind of calling out on the person's like better self, like you're better than that. Like that seems like it's kind of judgmental, you know, or like whatever, like let's be respectful and how can we be supportive of students, even if it's a fad or a phase. Something I also like to bring up when I do trainings often is recognizing that we are seeing more numbers of out LGBTQ people. The theory is that it's not because it is a fad or a phase or there's suddenly more of us, right? It's that because the culture is now more accepting and because we have more awareness thanks to things like the internet, right? So we can more easily find each other and be like, oh, you have this experience, I do too. It's okay. That's why we're seeing higher numbers. There's someone named Jacob Tobia, who is a well-known non-binary millennial, you know, on social media. And they said they love the metaphor of a snail, right? So if a snail feels like it's in a safe environment, right, it's gonna come out of its shell. But if it feels threatened, it's gonna go inside of its shell, right? So instead of if we wanna think of, you know, we have a more safe environment, then people are gonna be coming out and being their true selves. So that would be another potential talking point to that sentiment of it being a fad or a phase. It's actually just a culture change, right?
Another thing somebody could simply say, well, you know, I don't agree, but because I have friends that are, or a relative, or, you know, bring it kind of home for somebody. No.
Yeah, and it's personal. Yeah. And that's great too. I mean, we definitely know from LGBT history that, you know, as much hurt the AIDS crisis caused to our community, in some ways it helped push the movement for LGBT rights forward because it forced people out of the closet. And suddenly, you know, lots of people had someone that was, you know, oh, this is my uncle and I know he's gay, you know, he has, you know, HIV and things like that. And so when more and more people realize that they have folks in their lives who are in this community, then, you know, more acceptance can come too. Yeah. We'll try another scenario. And this is the one that I think, Jean, you brought this up earlier. So it's you're trying to be more inclusive with your language, but you still find yourself saying often, hey guys, how's it going? What do you do?
I think you have to be aware that you're doing that. That's like the first step, is notice that you say that, because you can't change it if it's, and obviously people use that term a lot, but it's like, oh, wait, okay, I said it again. What can I use instead? Because that's going to be a slow process, because it just is, but it's still not okay.
Right. Susan, yeah.
I find myself doing that sometimes, and have just, as you said earlier, Maddie, I just correct myself right away. Don't make a big deal, but I'll just say, so if I said, hey guys, how's it going? I mean, hey folks, how are you doing? And then just keep on with whatever it is.
We have a colleague who uses that all the time. Hey guys, did you do this? And so I'm going to mention it. I'm like, wait a minute, because it struck me, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, because I heard him use that again, and I'm like, wait a minute. And so I'm just going to say something, because he's probably not even aware, but.
Right. Yeah.
And again, it's something ingrained in people that you grow up with, and that's just the way people talk, you know? It's no intention, so it's that retraining piece.
Yeah.
I kind of grew up thinking that hey guys did not have a gender. It wasn't attributed to men or boys, that it was all of us.
Right.
So it's really hard to undo that kind of thinking.
And I would agree with you, Marita, on that one. Yeah.
I had a student many years ago who was a second grader, told me when I asked kids to lead warm-ups, they had turns leading warm-ups. And so if you were a boy leading warm-ups, you got to pick a girl and a boy to help you. And there would be two kids who were leaders and they could pick. And so this little girl was picked as a boy. And I said, you got to pick a girl. And she said, Ms. McKenzie, I am a boy. And so we talked about it later, and she told me to call her a boy's name. And so by the time she was in 4th grade, we were still having the conversation. We were pretty open. I was pretty close with the family and everything. And I said, why do you say that? And she said, because I like all boy things. I like all boy clothes, and I like sports. And I said, I like sports too. And I said, but I'm an athletic woman. And I said, maybe you're an athletic girl. She said, oh, maybe I am. But now she's a woman grown in her 20s now, and she identifies as a lesbian. I also want to say that it is really true about bullying people who are transgender or LGBTQ, whatever. My sister had a godchild who was a little girl, and as she grew, she was transgendering to a boy. She was a tiny little petite person. So by 8th grade, she was a he, and she was bullied and bullied and bullied. And this gorgeous, beautiful child who was always around my family had moved out west, and she couldn't take the bullying. And so one day she laid down on the railroad tracks in front of an oncoming train. And that is true, that there's so much bullying, and it is so difficult emotionally for these kiddos to deal with who they are themselves, and then to not be accepted. It's like, it's always in your face. It's a slap in the face. It's always questioning yourself. So it is true. That is a true story. And it's just really sad.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Marita. Is it?
And that story is not uncommon, you know, it's there's many tales. And one thing I've seen, Sue Campbell works at Out Maine and has done a lot of staff trainings at schools. And one of the things, I've attended one of her trainings, and she says that all of those risk factors that Maddie presented earlier, if students have supportive adults in their lives and supportive policies around them, that those risk factors immediately start to go down. So, I mean, you could be one of those people who uses their correct pronoun, or, could be one of those people who then gives them that validity, and so it's pretty it's pretty amazing how the risk factors go down when they have those supportive and accepting adults in their lives. So.
Yes, this particular child was totally accepted at home. As a matter of fact, the mom had been in a relationship with a woman, and then that ended and she got married to a man. Mm-hmm. So this child was completely accepted. They supported her. So, and she didn't let on to the impact of the bullying that was happening in school. So the parents were not expecting something like this, but she was totally supported at home by her family and friends. It was just like a school thing. So we
and
never.
Did you say the child identified as a boy, Marita?
Yes.
Yeah.
She was actually transitioning.
Yeah.
I think hormonal treatments had already begun for this child, so she was identifying as a boy.
Right. So we would want to probably use he, him pronouns for a child that identifies as a boy. Most likely, I assume, would use he, him pronouns. And I think it can be especially hard for young people because I have to say, for trans folks, there are kind of three categories of transitioning, right? There's the social transition. It's coming out and saying, I'm a boy, this is the name I'm using, and these are my pronouns, use them. But it's really hard because even with that social transition, maybe you change your hair or whatever, people are probably still going to read you as the sex you were assigned at birth, right? Because you have secondary sex characteristics that are telling the world, like, you say you're a boy, but I'm still calling you girl.
It's still in your brain. It's like
it's still in your brain, right? So the community and everyone has to be really intentional and, again, practice to respect the child, even because they likely don't have access to another type of transition, right? It's a medical transition, right? Things like hormones that would the voice to deepen or the facial hair to grow, right? And so when you don't have access to that, because maybe you're a minor or maybe you can't afford it or whatever, it's still really important to be respected within your gender identity. And then the third transition piece is the legal piece. We all have legal gender markers. And so again, it's a huge stressful thing of, I want people to see me as a boy, but I might not have access to being able to do that at this point. And so we have to make extra steps to rewire our brains so we're respecting people in their gender identity, even without having medically transitioned at all.
I think it's really difficult sometimes.
Absolutely.
I have a student who is a 4-year-old, came into school before kindergarten, hadn't turned 5, and was dressed in like flowery clothes, lace turned down socks, the whole 9 yards, came in with his grandmother or her grandmother and said, grandparent said, could you tell me where the bathroom is? And I said, the little girl's bathroom is down the hall, and she said, but he's a boy. And I said, okay. So I told her where it was. And now that child is in my class and looks like a girl, dresses like a girl in every way. And I would identify him as a girl, but until recently he would say, but I'm a boy. And so it's confusing to have a child that young. And so when, like when you make mistakes, and I've just said, I'm really sorry. And he said to me, or she said to me, it's okay. I want to be with the girls. It's okay. And so I think it's really hard. I think it's really hard for adults sometimes when the children are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And, I think like back in the day, we didn't have children it wasn't obvious, like maybe they weren't allowed to express themselves, you know, back in the day, because I don't recall, well, the child who told me she was really a boy is in her 20s, but long ago, I didn't see the evidence of it the way that I see it today.
Yeah, and like we had with the first scenario, even if a young person changes their gender, maybe in 4th grade they say I'm a girl, call me Sarah, and then in 8th grade they say I'm a boy, call me
Yeah.
Adam, and then when they're 20 they say, you know, something else, or you know, back to something. We still want to respect people wherever they are in the moment, right? Because that's going to help with their mental health and their feelings of connection and safety. So what you liked to wear when you were in 5th grade is probably different than what you liked to wear when you were 25 or 55, right? We're allowed to change, and we want to be respectful of people wherever they are at.
I think it's going to the parents too.
Absolutely.
And the one child who's now probably getting ready for high school, her information was out in the papers. It was public. She's Lucy. And she was like also like in 2nd grade, refusing to come to school unless her parents allowed her to dress as a girl.
Right.
And so she went through like all of this stuff, and her parents say to me, I miss my son, but I love my daughter, Lucy.
Oh.
And yeah. And she's the most beautiful child you've ever seen. I mean, you would not know that she wasn't a girl, but I think it is really tough for parents to, because, you know, this mom gave birth to a boy and she's like, my son is athletic and he is this and he is that. And then she has an athletic daughter, very athletic, beautiful daughter. I think that transitions are not easy for the child, the parent, the whole community.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about some resources at the end, because it can be a grief process for family and supportive adults, right? To have to be like, oh, like the person that, you know, I was relating to is now, you know, has changed and evolved. And so that can be a grief process. I think it's important, though, not to put your own kind of emotional processing on the child, right? Because they're going through their own stuff that they're having to deal with. They don't need to deal with all of your stuff right now, too.
I feel like it's good that the kids trust me and talk to me.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's great.
Absolutely.
I like what Lynette wrote. She said, even having pictures of people who don't represent traditional male, female gender roles or expressions posted in the classroom reminds everyone of the range of diversity in the world and our schools, communities. That's very important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynette. So let's jump into another scenario. So let's say you're trying to be really inclusive in your online classroom. You have scenarios with diverse people with diverse identities and experiences, but you still have one student in your class, you know, keep on calling you out and saying you're using the wrong language. What do you do?
I'm willing to talk about it and say, I'm learning. I'm trying really hard. I'm learning. I might make mistakes, but I'm trying really hard to get it right.
Yeah. David, you unmuted yourself.
I was just going to say, I had a basketball player that was transitioning, and I kept calling him he or she, and she went by the same name, which was good. So that helped me because I'm a knucklehead. And once in a while it'd slip up, and he was so sweet about it. Don't worry, just put me in the game, you know. So it's tough. You got to really, really think about how you're communicating to these kids. Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like you had a good relationship with the student.
Yes.
What about when questions come up? Should this boy who transitioned to be a girl be on a girls' team or a boys' team if they haven't started any medical procedures to change their hormones? Is it an advantage if you're a boy transitioning, wanting to be a girl, and you want to be on the girls' team? Do you have an advantage hormonally? How do we answer that? If we're, you know, like if we're supporting that child and saying this is where the child belongs, but you have the community saying, okay, so this is a boy, he has his testosterone, he's going to be stronger and bigger, this is an advantage. How do we address that?
Right. And I think, again, we have to
That's
look
a very
at our policies and state protections and the science that's out there. But again, students should be able to compete on the teams that match their gender identity.
Rita, it is not easy because that does come up a lot in the sports arena, high school sports arena.
Hey, can you say that again?
I said that conversation does come up quite a bit. I heard
Okay.
it multiple times.
Okay.
So
Right.
it is nice to think about what is the answer when it comes up.
Right. And there's kind of like the legal answer was like, sorry what you think, but like this is what we're doing based on like, you know, legal protections. And then there's also just kind of understanding that we all both have estrogen and testosterone in us, right? And biological variation is normal. So there's nothing to say that someone who maybe was assigned male at birth, identifies as a girl playing on the girls' team, has more testosterone than another player on the team. We see that having come up again with folks who are intersex within the Olympics. And historically in the Olympics, they made people, women drop their pants so that they could make sure that they were women before they competed. Now we have more technology, so now they do a swab, but we've had athletes not even know that they have, you know, maybe XY chromosomes, but, you know, were raised as women, identify as women, et cetera, et cetera. And it just goes to show, again, there's immense amount of biological variation. And while we hold rigidly to these two distinct categories and we expect them to have certain levels of hormones and body morphology and whatever, there's huge variation. And some girls can lift more than, you know, other girls, and some boys can run faster than other boys, and it's just, everyone's different. David.
Wasn't there a case, I think it was just completed in court where these girl track athletes brought a lawsuit against these girls who were formerly boys that beat them. And how do you feel about something like that? I looked at that. I thought that was so difficult for all involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think my personal opinion, this doesn't matter, but again, kind of like the sentiment behind it and the importance, again, to just rely on being inclusive of LGBTQ folks and respecting them and their gender identities. So, but back to the scenario we had real quick. Lynette, you put a comment in the chat. Do you want to speak to that so I don't have to talk?
Oh, I was just thinking of that scenario where you have a student in the class who seems to be a lot more advanced in terms of their ability to use the correct pronouns and have a whole range of, you know, terminology that they know that no one else knows, or that you as a teacher might be wrong. And I've seen that a lot, and it's, you know, you want to like say, yeah, you know, that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. But at some point you need to say, well, you know, you have a lot of information, but not everybody else does. So we're going to learn together. And, you know, so it's all in different places, because it is pretty funny when you get called out and you're like, sometimes you just make a joke and like, yeah, I know, in my generation, you know, you're lucky that, you know, from a younger age, your parents were talking to you about this. My parents still don't talk to me about this. So, you know, trying to make a joke, and they are sometimes not very patient, but us
Right.
not being as progressive as they think we should be.
Absolutely. And again, with a lot of these scenarios, there's no one way to handle the situation, right? You know, I think if the student obviously has a lot of passion and interest in the topic, you know, maybe you're also like, hey, it seems like you know a lot about this. Do you want to have 20 minutes in a class to do an activity and, you know, teach us, or, you know, something like that, and kind of empowering them to take a leadership role at some point. You know, there's many different ways you can handle it. But since we're closing in on 11:30, I just want to talk about some resources. So I'm just going to copy and paste some organizations in the chat that you might want to take a look at if you're looking for more resources. So Out Maine is a great organization. They're based in Rockland, but they do trainings, I believe, and work a lot with schools. Equality Maine also does trainings, and they also have like youth leadership opportunities for LGBTQ youth. There's different, depending on where you are, Portland outright, Lewiston Auburn outright, and Health Equity Alliance has a LGBTQ youth group in Bangor. You know, seeing what you can do if you have students interested in a GSA on campus, supporting their work. And then GLAD and GLISTEN are two national organizations, but they both have a lot of resources. GLISTEN has a lot of resources based for students and schools, and GLAD is a legal advocacy organization. So if you're looking like, what are the legal protections, or I think there's some sort of potential legal issue, they would be a resource. And then Teaching Tolerance also has great toolkits on inclusivity, not only for LGBTQ students, but students of different cultures or races, abilities, etc.
And Teaching Tolerance is a website, right?
Sorry?
Teaching Tolerance is a website.
They have a website. I think they also have a magazine, maybe.
Okay, and
They have a magazine too. Yeah.
Yeah.
and the other one that came to mind for me is the civil rights teams that out of the AG's office. They, I think, are another good resource.
I'll put that there.
And some schools have gay, straight alliances, so it's also good.
And I'm just going to share my screen really quick because there is, if you go to GLISTEN, they also have these safe space kits, and you can see they have PDFs. So if you are on a budget, but you have a printer, a color printer, you can download, say, a poster and print it out and put that in your classroom. Like I said, we want to be visibly inclusive so students know that we're a safe person to come to for if they need support. So.
Maddie, your screen hasn't come through yet. It's just black.
Oh, well.
Something about double click to enter the full screen mode.
Well, I could see it on mine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got it.
You got
You
it?
got it?
Okay. I
Maybe
was
it's
gonna say,
not mine.
I can copy and paste the URL too. That's helpful. All right. Well, that's all our time. I want to respect everyone's time.
Thank you so
That was
much, Maggie.
great,
That was awesome. That was really, really good.